A throne denied, a fortune built on distant shores, dragon fire scorching the stepstones, while the richest man in Westeros watches his legacy turn to ash. 9 legendary voyages across uncharted seas, a marriage to a queen who never was, children who rode dragons yet could not escape their fate, grandsons whose very existence sparked a civil war that would consume the realm in flame. This is the story of Corlys Velaryon, the sea snake, lord of the tides, master of Driftmark, a man who sailed beyond the edge of the known world and returned with wealth that rivaled kings, yet could not buy the one thing he desired most: his blood upon the Iron Throne. He fought wars that shaped the destiny of Westeros. He commanded fleets that controlled the narrow sea. He brokered alliances with dragon riders and princes, but every victory came with a price written in the blood of those he loved. Imagine standing on the driftwood throne of high tide, silver hair gleaming in the salt wind, surrounded by treasures from Korth and Yi-Te, from the Shadowlands beyond Ashai. The smell of exotic spices, the sound of waves against ancient Valyrian stone. You are the most powerful man outside the Red Keep itself, and yet, in the end, you will lose everything. A daughter burned alive by her own dragon, a son whose death may have been a carefully staged lie, grandsons drowned, betrayed, denied, a wife who stood beside you through decades of ambition and grief. All of them gone, and you left standing in an empty castle, listening to the eternal song of the sea that gave you everything and took it all away. Hey everyone! Tonight we journey into the heart of Westeros during its most turbulent age. The tale of a man who conquered distant seas but could not protect his own family. The sea snake whose ambition burned as bright as dragon fire and left just as much destruction in its wake. So before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these deep dives into the legends of ice and fire. Let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you. It is always incredible to see who joins us from around the world. Now dim the lights, get comfortable under your blanket, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins in the year 53 AC, 53 years after Aegon the Conqueror united the 7 kingdoms beneath the shadow of his dragons. On the island of Driftmark, a child is born into House Velaryon, one of the oldest and most distinguished Valyrian bloodlines in Westeros. This is not King's Landing with its stench and crowded streets. This is not the ancient seat of Dragonstone, with its smoking mountain. Driftmark rises from the waters of Blackwater Bay, like a jewel of pale stone and driftwood. The castle of high tide stands as a monument to seafaring power, its halls decorated with treasures from across the known world. Carved driftwood beams support ceilings painted with maps of distant lands. The air carries the scent of salt and exotic spices, cinnamon from Yi-Te, saffron from the Summer Isles, strange incense from Ashai. The child born this day is named Corlys, and from his first breath the sea calls to him. The Velaryons are an ancient house, their bloodline stretching back to old Valyria itself, before the doom consumed that mighty civilization in fire and ash. They came to Westeros before the Targaryens, establishing their seat on Driftmark and building the greatest fleet in the known world. While the Targaryens rode dragons, the Velaryons mastered the seas. Fast forward now through the years, see Corlys Velaryon at the height of his power, perhaps 60 years of age, though the exact moment matters less than the man himself. He stands tall and commanding, his bearing that of someone who has faced down storms that would break lesser men. Silver gold hair, the mark of old Valyria, falls to his shoulders. His face is weathered by decades of sea wind and salt spray, lined with the wisdom of a man who has sailed beyond the edge of every map. His eyes are sharp, calculating, missing nothing. When he walks through the halls of high tide, servants bow, lords step aside, and even princes take notice. His hands, calloused from rope and sail, are decorated with rings of gold and jade, gifts from the distant east. He wears robes of sea green and silver, the colors of his house, embroidered with seahorses and ships. At his hip hangs a sword of Valyrian steel, a family heirloom worth more than most lords will see in a lifetime. This is Lord Corlys Velaryon, the sea snake. 9 times he circumnavigated the world, visiting lands no Westerosi had seen in generations. He walked the jade halls of Korth. He traded with the Golden Emperor of Yi. He sailed through the mists of the Shadowlands, where even the bravest sailors fear to venture. And he returned from each voyage richer than before. By the time most noble sons have learned to hold a sword properly, Corlys Velaryon had already decided his destiny lay elsewhere. At 16, while other lordlings practiced their courtesies and dreamed of tournaments, he stood on the deck of a trading vessel bound for Pentos, learning the language of wind and wave. His family understood. The Velaryons had always been sailors first, nobles second. His grandfather, a legendary seafarer in his own right, took the boy under his wing. Together they sailed to Pentos, that sprawling city of merchants and sellswords across the narrow sea. Corlys learned to read the stars, to feel the shift of currents beneath the hull, to smell a storm coming hours before it darkened the horizon. He scrubbed decks alongside common sailors. He learned their songs, their superstitions, their hard-won wisdom about the temperament of the sea. The ocean became his teacher, more patient and more demanding than any maester could ever be. When he returned to Driftmark months later, something had changed in him. The boy who left had become someone harder, sharper, hungry for more than the comfortable life of a Westerosi lord. He had tasted the wider world, and it had awakened something fierce in his blood. His first command came at 18. A small trading vessel, nothing grand, but it was his. He named her after himself, the Sea Snake, a creature that moves through water with deadly grace and purpose. And with that ship, he began to write his legend. The first 3 voyages took him to the free cities, those proud remnants of Valyrian glory scattered along the western coast of Essos. Pentos, where the merchants wore oiled beards and spoke in honeyed tones while calculating profit margins. Braavos, the secret city built by escaped slaves, where the Titan stood guard over the lagoon and the Iron Bank held the debts of kingdoms. Volantis, oldest of the free cities, where the black walls still stood, and the descendants of old Valyria clung to their fading supremacy. In each port, Corlys learned the art of trade. Not just the buying and selling of goods, but the deeper game beneath, who to trust, who to watch, how to read the political currents that shifted like tides. He brought Westerosi wool and leather, grain and timber. He returned with Mirish lace and Tyroshi dyes, with steel from Korhor and amber from the shores of the Shivering Sea. His wealth began to grow, not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily, like a tree putting down roots. But Corlys had never been content with steady. He wanted more. The 4th voyage changed everything. While other Westerosi captains were satisfied to trade along familiar routes, Corlys set his sights on something more ambitious. He would sail to Korth, the greatest city on the far side of the known world. The journey would take him through the Stepstones, around the coast of Dorne, past the Summer Isles, and into waters that few living Westerosi had ever seen. His crew thought he was mad. His family urged caution, but Corlys had inherited the boldness of old Valyria, and caution had never built empires. The voyage took the better part of a year. They weathered storms that tore sails to ribbons. They navigated through pirate-infested waters where ships vanished without trace. They stopped at the Summer Isles where the people wore bright feathers and the air smelled of flowers even in winter. They sailed the coast of Sothorios, the dark continent where even the bravest explorers turned back in fear. And finally, After months of sailing, they saw it, Koth, the greatest city that ever was or ever will be, as its people proudly claimed. The city rose from the desert like a fever dream. 3 great walls surrounded it, each more magnificent than the last. The outer wall was plain red sandstone, 30 feet high and strong. But the second wall, the walls of Koth proper, those were carved and painted, covered in scenes of beasts and battles, of ancient kings and forgotten gods. And the innermost wall, protecting the most ancient and wealthy quarters, that wall gleamed with beaten gold in the desert sun. Corlys walked through streets where merchants from every corner of the world haggled in a dozen languages. He saw silks finer than anything in Westeros, so light they seemed woven from colored air. He tasted spices that made his tongue burn and his mind reel. He met warlocks who claimed to see the future in their flames, and shadowbinders from Ashai who traded in secrets darker than any maester's wisdom. He returned to Driftmark 18 months after he left, his ship's hold bursting with goods that no one in Westeros had seen in a generation. Koth jade and Koth silk, spices whose very names were forgotten in the 7 kingdoms, maps and charts of lands beyond imagination. The wealth from that single voyage could have set up a lesser house for 3 generations. Corlys immediately began planning his 5th. The next 2 voyages took him even further, to Yi Ti, the golden empire of the distant east, where cities older than Valyria sprawled along the shores of the Jade Sea. The journey there was longer, harder, more dangerous than anything before. They sailed past Koth and onward, into waters marked on no Westerosi map. Yi Ti was everything Koth had been, and more. A civilization ancient beyond reckoning, with emperors who traced their lineage back 5,000 years. They had built cities of such size that King's Landing would fit inside them 10 times over. Their sorcerers studied in pagodas that touched the clouds. Their craftsmen made porcelain so fine you could see light through it, silk so smooth it felt like water against skin. Corlys spent months there, learning their customs, earning their trust. He met with merchant princes and studied their methods. He saw armies drill with discipline that would put any Westerosi knight to shame. He learned that the world was far larger and stranger than any Septon's lesson had ever suggested. The 6th voyage expanded his reach even further. To the 1,000 islands of the Jade Sea, each one a tiny kingdom unto itself. Some were ruled by pirate queens, others by religious orders that had held their sanctuaries for centuries. Each island had its own laws, its own customs, its own goods to trade. By now, Corlys Velaryon had become a legend among sailors. In every port from Driftmark to the edge of the world, men knew his name, the Sea Snake, the captain who sailed where others feared to go and always returned richer than before. But he had not yet attempted the journey that would cement his legend forever. The 7th voyage took him to Leng, that mysterious island wrapped in mist and rumor, and beyond Leng, to the Shadowlands that lay in the shadow of Ashai. This was the edge of the world, where maps ended and nightmares began. Even the bravest Yi Ti sailors refused to venture there. The very air was said to be poisoned. The water ran black and thick, strange lights danced in the darkness, and those who followed them were never seen again. What Corlys saw in the Shadowlands, he rarely spoke of afterward, but he returned changed, quieter, more thoughtful, and unimaginably wealthy. The goods he brought back, dark amber and ghost grass, dragon glass, and stranger things still, sold for prices that defied belief. His 8th voyage was a return to Yi Ti, but this time as a recognized friend of the Golden Empire. He established permanent trading relationships, agreements that would benefit House Velaryon for generations. He was received by the Azure Emperor himself, a meeting no Westerosi had been granted in living memory. And then came the 9th voyage, the greatest of them all. At 37 years old, Corlys Velaryon set out to circumnavigate the entire known world. Not just to visit distant ports, but to sail around the world itself, to prove it could be done. 3 years the journey took him. 3 years of storms and calms, of battles with pirates and negotiations with foreign princes, of wonders and terrors beyond counting. When he finally returned to Driftmark, he was no longer just a successful merchant captain. He was the Sea Snake, the greatest sailor in living memory. His fleet had grown from a single ship to dozens. His wealth exceeded that of any lord in Westeros save the king himself. House Velaryon, already ancient and respected, had become a power that even the Iron Throne had to acknowledge. At 40, Corlys Velaryon stood atop the world he had conquered. 9 legendary voyages completed, a fortune that seemed unlimited, a reputation that would outlive him by centuries. But all the gold in Yee, all the jade in Karth, all the exotic wonders of the furthest corners of the world could not buy him the one thing he truly wanted, the thing that would consume the rest of his life and destroy nearly everything he loved. He wanted his blood on the Iron Throne, and that ambition would cost him more than any storm at sea ever could. The year 90 AC brought a wedding that would reshape the destiny of House Velaryon. Corlys, now 37 and at the height of his fame, took a bride who was his equal in pride and ambition. Princess Rhaenys Targaryen, granddaughter of King Jaehaerys the Conciliator himself. But to understand this marriage, we must step back 11 years earlier to the Great Council of 101 AC. King Jaehaerys had ruled wisely for decades, but age and grief had worn him down. His sons were dead. Prince Aemon, his eldest and heir, killed by a crossbow bolt on Tarth. Prince Balon, the brave, his second son, dead of a burst belly. The question of succession had become a crisis that threatened to tear the realm apart. 2 candidates emerged: Rhaenys, daughter of Prince Aemon, the eldest line, and Viserys, son of Prince Balon, but male. The entire realm gathered at Harrenhal to decide. Lords and knights, septons and maesters, all came to cast their votes. The debate raged for days. Rhaenys had the stronger claim by primogeniture, the law of the eldest child, but she was a woman. Westeros had never been ruled by a queen in her own right. Many lords feared what it would mean to set such a precedent. Others argued that sex should not matter, that the eldest line must always prevail. In the end, the votes were not even close. The lords of Westeros chose Viserys, not because he was more qualified, not because he was worthier, but simply because he was male. Rhaenys was passed over, denied the throne that by every law of inheritance should have been hers. She became known as the Queen Who Never Was, a title that would define her for the rest of her life. This was the woman Corlys Velaryon married, proud, fierce, brilliant, and carrying a bitterness that would never fully heal. She rode the dragon Melis, called the Red Queen for her scarlet scales and crimson wings. When Rhaenys flew, the sky itself seemed to catch fire. The marriage began as a political alliance. Corlys wanted to tie his house to the dragons, to elevate the Velaryons from mere lords to something approaching royal status. Rhaenys wanted an ally who understood what it meant to be denied what was rightfully yours. The Sea Snake had conquered distant seas, but the Iron Throne had never acknowledged him as anything more than a jumped-up merchant with delusions of grandeur. They shared that hunger, that sense of being owed something the world refused to give. But somewhere in the years that followed, something unexpected happened. The political marriage became genuine partnership. Corlys found in Rhaenys a woman whose will matched his own, whose intelligence could match him word for word in any discussion. She found in him a man who never once suggested she was lesser for being female, who valued her counsel and respected her judgment. They were formidable together, the Sea Snake and the Queen Who Never Was. In 92 AC, Rhaenys gave birth to their first child, a daughter, who they named Lelaina. From the moment she could walk, the girl showed the fearlessness of both her parents. She climbed the highest towers of High Tide without fear. She demanded to learn swordplay alongside the boys. And when she was old enough to be presented with a dragon egg, she stared at it with such intensity that the servants swore they saw it tremble. 2 years later, in 94 AC, came their son, Landor. Where Lyanandor was bold and fierce, Landor was gentler, more thoughtful. He loved music and poetry. He would rather spend an afternoon reading than practicing with sword and shield. But he was kind, genuinely kind, in a way that was rare among the nobility. Both children bonded with dragons young. Latella, at 12 years old, would claim Vhagar, the oldest and largest dragon alive, a beast that had carried Visenya Targaryen herself during the conquest. It was an audacious claim for such a young girl, but Vhagar accepted her, and together they became a force that made even older dragon riders respect her. Lyanandor bonded with Seasmoke, a younger dragon with scales of pale silver that seemed to glow in moonlight. Together they would fly over Driftmark, dragon and rider moving as one, a sight that never failed to draw crowds. High Tide became a place of wonder in those years. Dragons roosted on the towers. Ships from every corner of the world filled the harbor. The halls overflowed with treasures from a dozen kingdoms. Silks from Yutei hung beside tapestries from Norvos, jade from Leng sat in cases next to amber from the Shivering Sea. The smell of foreign spices mixed with salt air. Corlys taught his children about the wider world. He showed them maps of the routes he had sailed, told them stories of the wonders he had seen. He wanted them to understand that Westeros was just one small part of a vast world, that their heritage as Velaryons meant they were citizens of the sea, not bound by the narrow thinking of landlocked lords. Rhaenys taught them about power and legacy. She made sure they understood their place in history, their connection to the Targaryen dynasty. She taught Lyanna that being female was not a weakness but a challenge to overcome. She taught Lyanna that gentleness was not the same as weakness, that there were many kinds of strength. But both parents taught them the same bitter lesson, that being close to power was not the same as having it. That no matter how wealthy they were, how many dragons they commanded, how much their family had achieved, they would always be second to those who wore the crown. Corlys served briefly on King Jaehaerys' small council, his knowledge of trade and the sea making him invaluable. But he was never truly welcomed by the old powers of Westeros. To them he was still just a sailor who had gotten lucky, a merchant with pretensions. They took his advice when it suited them, and ignored him when it did not. The resentment built slowly, like water behind a dam. Corlys watched lesser men with older names receive honors he had earned twice over. He watched his wife, who should have been queen, forced to curtsy to women she outranked in blood and ability. He watched his children grow up beautiful and talented in dragon riding, and knew that their Velaryon name would always be a barrier to true power. Lyanna showed, as he grew older, certain preferences that made his path even more complicated. He favored the company of young men, particularly a knight named Sir Joffrey Lonmouth. In private, Corlys and Rhaenys acknowledged this without judgment. Their son's happiness mattered more than convention, but they also understood that in the rigid world of Westerosi nobility, such preferences could be used as weapons against him. By the time King Jaehaerys died and his grandson Viserys took the throne, Corlys Velaryon had everything a man could want except the one thing that mattered most to him. His blood on the Iron Throne, his family ruling the Seven Kingdoms. And he was willing to sacrifice almost anything to make that happen. The opportunity would come soon enough. King Viserys would need allies. Rhaenyra, his daughter, would need a husband. And Corlys would see his chance to finally achieve what had been denied to him and his wife. What he could not see What none of them could see was the price that ambition would demand, the lives it would cost, the family it would destroy, the legacy it would leave in blood and ash. But that knowledge lay in the future, obscured by dreams of crowns and thrones. For now, in the halls of high tide, surrounded by his family and his treasures, Corlys Velaryon believed he was building something that would last forever. He had sailed to the edge of the world and back. How hard could it be to place his blood on a throne? The sea would teach him the answer to that question, and the lesson would break his heart. In the year 106 AC, 300 miles south of Driftmark, a collection of rocky islands sat astride the most valuable shipping lanes in the known world, the Stepstones, barren, windswept, strategically priceless. Any ship sailing from the free cities to Westeros, or from Westeros to the eastern markets, had to pass through these narrow channels, control the Stepstones, and you controlled the lifeblood of trade itself. For generations, pirates and exiles had used these islands as bases, but they were disorganized, manageable. Then the Triarchy changed everything. 3 free cities, Maya, Liz, and Tyrosh, put aside their ancient rivalries and formed an alliance. They pooled their resources, hired armies of sellswords, and launched a coordinated assault on the Stepstones. Within months, every island fell under their control. They installed governors, built fortifications, and most importantly, they began charging tolls. Every ship that passed through their waters now paid tribute to the Triarchy. The impact on House Velaryon was immediate and devastating. Corlys had built his fortune on free trade. His ships plied routes from Westeros to Essos and beyond, carrying goods in both directions. The Triarchy's tolls ate into his profits like rust eating through iron. Worse, some of his ships simply vanished, captured by pirates who now operated with the Triarchy's blessing. Crews killed or sold into slavery. Cargoes seized, years of carefully built relationships damaged as merchants blamed House Velaryon for failing to protect the sea lanes. Corlys brought the matter before King Viserys and the small council. He laid out the threat clearly. The Triarchy was not simply demanding reasonable fees for safe passage. They were strangling trade, threatening the prosperity of the entire realm. If Westeros did not act now, the free cities would control every shipping route that mattered. King Viserys listened politely. The small council debated, and in the end, they did nothing. Viserys was a kind man, a peaceful man, a man who wanted nothing more than to rule in harmony. The idea of sending ships and men to fight a war over some distant islands held no appeal for him. Let the merchants find other routes. Let the Triarchy have their tolls. Westeros had more important concerns. Corlys left that council meeting with rage burning in his chest like dragonfire. He had spent decades proving himself, building wealth and power, earning respect through achievement rather than simply inheriting a name. And still, when it mattered, when his livelihood and his legacy were threatened, the king dismissed him, treated him like an inconvenience. A rich merchant complaining about lost profits. That night, Corlys made a decision that would change his life and reshape the politics of Westeros for a generation. If the king would not act, he would act himself. He was not without allies. Prince Daemon Targaryen, the king's younger brother, was champing for action of any kind. Daemon was everything Viserys was not: bold, reckless, hungry for glory and combat. He had been named heir to the throne before Viserys had children, but as the years passed and Rhaenyra was born, his position became increasingly uncertain. He needed a war, something to prove himself, something to build his own power base, separate from his brother's shadow. When Corlys approached him with a proposal, Daemon agreed immediately. They would raise a private army, hire sellswords with Velaryon gold, and take the Stepstones by force. No permission asked, no royal approval sought. In 106 AC, their war began. Corlys commanded the largest private fleet ever assembled. Dozens of warships from massive war galleys to swift patrol boats, all bearing the seahorse of House Velaryon. He hired the best sellsword companies in Essos, men who fought not for honor but for gold, and Corlys had more gold than he could spend in 3 lifetimes. Daemon brought dragons. He rode Caraxes, the bloodworm, a lean red beast with a serpentine neck and a savage temperament that matched his rider perfectly. When Caraxes flew over a battlefield, screaming his challenge, men broke and ran before a single blow was struck. The strategy was brutal and effective. Corlys would sail his fleet to an island, land his troops, and establish a beachhead. Then Daemon would arrive on Dragonback, raining fire on any fortification that resisted. One by one, the islands fell. Some garrisons surrendered immediately when they saw Caraxes circling overhead. Others fought and died, their strongholds reduced to smoking ruins. But the Triarchy did not give up easily. They poured more troops into the stepstones. They hired their own sellsword companies. They developed tactics to fight dragons, scorpions that could pierce dragon hide. If the shot was perfect, ambush sites where a dragon flying too low could be brought down by concentrated fire. The war dragged on. 1 year became 2. 2 became 3. The battles grew fiercer. Corlys lost ships, good ships, vessels that had sailed with him to the far corners of the world. He lost men, sailors and soldiers who had served House Velaryon faithfully. The gold flowed out like water, faster than even his vast fortune could easily sustain. Daemon reveled in it. He was in his element, fighting battles, burning enemies, playing at kingship. After a particularly brutal victory, his men crowned him king of the narrow sea, fashioning a driftwood crown and placing it on his head while he laughed. Corlys stood beside him during that ceremony, smiling for the assembled troops, but inside he felt a growing unease. This was supposed to be his war, his campaign to protect his interests and prove his power. But Daemon, with his dragon and his Targaryen name, was taking all the glory. The songs the men sang were about Daemon the rogue prince, Daemon the warrior, Daemon the dragon rider. Corlys was merely the man who paid for everything. Still, they won. In 108 AC, after 3 years of grinding warfare, the Triarchy forces were driven from the stepstones. Every island flew either the Velaryon seahorse or Daemon's personal standard. The shipping lanes were open again. Trade resumed. Victory hard-earned and blood-bought, but victory nonetheless. They returned to Westeros as heroes. Common folk lined the streets to cheer them. Songs were sung in taverns about their exploits. They had done what the king refused to do, protected the realm's interests through their own initiative and courage. King Viserys was not pleased. His brother, wearing a crown and styling himself a king, was a direct insult to royal authority. The small council saw only the danger of a precedent where lords could wage private wars whenever they pleased. Corlys and Daemon were received at court with cold courtesy rather than the welcome they expected. Corlys realized something in those days. Victory was meaningless if those in power refused to acknowledge it. He had spent a fortune, lost good men, fought a 3-year war to protect Westerosi interests, and his reward was royal disapproval and barely concealed contempt from the older noble houses. The sea snake returned to high tide with a deeper understanding of how the world truly worked. Skill and achievement meant nothing if you lacked the one thing that could not be earned or bought: legitimacy. The kind that came only from blood and marriage and the acceptance of those who already held power. He had wanted to prove House Velaryon's worth through action. Instead, he had merely confirmed what the older houses already believed, that he was an upstart, a merchant with delusions of nobility, someone to be used when convenient and dismissed when his usefulness ended. The war had forged bonds between Corlys and Daemon that would prove significant in years to come. They had fought together, bled together, shared the intoxication of victory and the bitterness of watching lesser men dismiss their achievements. That connection would pull them both into the maelstrom that was coming. But for now, in the immediate aftermath of the Stepstones War, Corlys felt the weight of a truth he had been avoiding. No amount of gold, no number of victories, no legendary voyages to distant lands would ever be enough. Not for the lords of Westeros, not for the small council, not for the king. If he wanted his family to sit the Iron Throne, he would need to find another way, a way that used the tools Westeros actually valued. Marriage, blood, dragons. And opportunity was coming. King Viserys had just lost his wife in childbirth. The realm held its breath, waiting to see who the king would choose as his new queen. Corlys had a daughter. Beautiful, accomplished, a dragon rider, 12 years old, and already turning heads at every gathering. Perhaps gold and glory were not the path after all. Perhaps the path to power ran through marriage beds and birthing chambers. The sea snake began to plan his next move. This time, he would play the game by Westeros's rules, and this time, he was certain, he would finally get what he desired. The sea had taught him patience, had taught him that sometimes you had to tack against the wind, take an indirect route to reach your destination. He could be patient, he could be indirect. As long as the destination remained the same, his blood on the Iron Throne, his family ruling the Seven Kingdoms, everything else was just tactics. The year 112 AC brought an opportunity that seemed almost too perfect. Queen Aemma Arryn, King Viserys's beloved wife, died in childbirth, along with the son she had tried to give him. The realm mourned, but the practicalities of power moved swiftly. The king needed an heir. The king needed a new wife. Corlys saw his chance. Lyanna was 12 years old, freshly flowered according to the customs of the time, though still very much a child in many ways. She had inherited her mother's striking beauty and her father's bold spirit. More importantly, she was a dragon rider. Vhagar, the ancient she-dragon, who had carried Visenya Targaryen during the conquest, had accepted Lyanna as her rider. It was an audacious claim for someone so young, but the girl had walked right up to that massive creature without fear, and somehow, impossibly, Vhagar had lowered her great head in acceptance. A Velaryon who rode the largest living dragon in the world, a girl with Targaryen blood through her mother, beautiful, accomplished, connected to the most powerful house in the realm, after the royal family itself. On parchment, she was the perfect candidate to become queen. The small council discussed the matter. Grand Maester Runseter suggested Lyanna specifically. Her youth was not seen as a problem, but as an advantage. She could give the king many children, many heirs, ensuring the succession for generations. Her connection to House Velaryon would bring the richest house in the realm firmly into the royal fold. Her dragon would add to the crown's strength. Corlys hardly dared to breathe as he waited for the decision. This was it. This was everything he had worked for. His daughter as queen, his grandchildren on the Iron Throne, the Velaryon name elevated to royalty itself. All the slights, all the dismissals, all the barely concealed contempt from lesser men with older names, it would all be washed away in the glory of a crown. He imagined it constantly. Lyanna in the Red Keep, wearing royal purple and gold. His grandchildren learning to rule the Seven Kingdoms. Himself as the king's father by law. His council finally given the weight it deserved. House Velaryon would become House Targaryen's equal, bound together by blood and marriage. Rhaenys watched her husband's growing excitement with concern. She knew that expression. That hunger in his eyes. She had seen it before, in the years before the Stepstones War. When Corlys wanted something, he pursued it with an intensity that bordered on obsession. And Lyanna was just a child, barely understanding what it would mean to become queen, to bear the weight of the crown and the burden of royal children. But Rhaenys also understood power. She had been denied the throne herself. Perhaps her daughter could achieve what she could not. Perhaps this was the vindication their family deserved. Then Viserys made his choice, and it was not Laenor. Alicent Hightower, the daughter of Otto Hightower, the Hand of the King. A girl who had been Rhaenyra's closest friend, who had been quietly visiting the grieving king during his mourning, reading to him, comforting him. She had no dragon. Her family, while noble and ancient, could not begin to match House Velaryon's wealth. She brought no particular strategic advantage. But she had been there, present, available. And perhaps most importantly, she made Viserys feel less alone. The announcement hit Corlys like a physical blow. He had been so certain. The logic had been so clear. Everything pointed to Laenor as the obvious, the perfect choice. How could the king choose a mere courtier's daughter over a dragon-riding princess of Valyrian blood? But he had, and there was nothing Corlys could do about it. The wound to Velaryon pride went deep. Corlys had spent decades proving his worth, and still, when it came to the most important decision, his family was passed over. Not because they were unworthy, but because they were inconvenient. Because Otto Hightower had played the game better, positioning his daughter in the king's path during his moment of vulnerability. For the second time, a Velaryon woman had been denied a throne she was suited for. First Rhaenys, passed over by the Great Council, now Laenor, rejected. Despite having everything the realm could want in a queen, the pattern was clear. House Velaryon would always be second, always close to power, but never quite holding it. Laenor herself seemed remarkably unbothered by the rejection. When her parents told her the king had chosen another, she simply nodded and went back to preparing for her next flight with Vhagar. Politics held little interest for her. The sky, the wind, the feeling of a dragon beneath her, that was what she loved. Being queen would have meant staying in King's Landing, attending tedious court functions, bearing children for a man old enough to be her father. From her perspective, she had dodged a miserable fate. But to save face and maintain some strategic advantage, another marriage was quickly arranged. The son of the Sea Lord of Braavos, a wealthy match that would strengthen trade ties with the most powerful of the free cities. The betrothal was agreed upon, contracts signed, celebrations planned. Then fate intervened in a way no one had anticipated. The Sea Lord died. His son Lyonors intended proved to be everything his father had not been. A beastrisel, a fool, a young man who managed to squander his inheritance with stunning speed. Within months the family's wealth and power evaporated. The marriage that had seemed so advantageous now looked like a disaster waiting to happen. Corlys could not simply break the betrothal. Honor demanded he uphold the agreement. But he also could not stomach watching his daughter marry a penniless fool. So he did what many powerful men do when faced with an uncomfortable obligation. He delayed, found excuses, postponed the wedding again and again. Months became years. The son of the former Sea Lord eventually showed up at Driftmark, desperate and pathetic, but still technically Laenor's betrothed. The situation hung in uncomfortable limbo for nearly a decade. Laenor remained unmarried, technically promised to a man everyone knew she would never actually wed. She spent her time flying Vhagar, visiting her brother and parents, living a life of freedom that few noble women ever experienced. If the betrothal bothered her, she never showed it. The sky was her kingdom, and it was enough. Then in 115 AC, Prince Daemon Targaryen arrived at Driftmark. Daemon and Corlys had remained close after the Stepstones War. They understood each other, these two men who felt perpetually undervalued by those around them. Daemon's marriage to Lady Rhea Royce had been loveless and was now ended by her death under suspicious circumstances. He was free, unmoored, looking for his next move. Lyanna was 23 now, a woman grown, still beautiful, still fierce, still bonded to the largest dragon in the world. And Daemon, for all his flaws, had never been one to follow convention. The singers would later claim he fell in love with her at first sight. More pragmatic observers believed he saw an opportunity, a Velaryon alliance, a massive dragon, a way to rebuild his power base after years of drifting. The truth probably lay somewhere in between. Daemon and Lyanna were genuinely drawn to each other. Both were dragon riders who felt constrained by the expectations of others. Both chafed at the rules of Westerosi society. Both wanted something more than the life that had been laid out for them. They married quickly, quietly, without asking permission from king or council. And then they did something that scandalized the realm. They left, simply mounted their dragons, and flew east, away from Westeros, away from politics and scheming and the endless dance for power. For the next several years, they made their home in Pentos, that wealthy, free city that welcomed dragon riders with open arms. They traveled together, Lyanna on Vhagar and Daemon on Caraxes, two of the mightiest dragons in the world. They flew to Volantis, up the Rhoyne to Qohor and Norvos, putting on displays of dragonfire that left crowds gasping. They were free in a way neither had ever been in Westeros. In 116 AC, Lyanna gave birth to twin daughters in Pentos, Lalila and Rhalyna, two perfect girls with silver hair and violet eyes, the unmistakable marks of old Valyria. Corlys received the news with joy tempered by distance. His grandchildren, born in a foreign land, growing up far from Driftmark and the life he had imagined for them. Lysina would occasionally sail to Driftmark with the babies while Daemon flew the dragons home, and those visits were precious to Corlys. He could hold his granddaughters, watch them grow, teach them about their heritage, but they always left again, drawn back to the freedom of Essos, away from the suffocating protocols of Westerosi nobility. For a time, it seemed Lyanna had found something rare, happiness on her own terms. A husband who valued her strength rather than seeking to control it. Children she could raise away from the poisonous politics of the Red Keep. The sky, the sea, the world spread out before her. But in 120 AC, everything changed. Lysina was pregnant again with her third child. She and Daemon were still in Pentos, still living their unconventional life. The pregnancy was difficult from the start. The baby sat wrong. The labor when it came lasted a day and a night. Lysina screaming and struggling while maesters and midwives tried everything they knew. The child was born twisted and malformed, barely recognizable as human. It died within an hour, never drawing more than a few struggling breaths. Lyanna had given everything she had to that labor. Her strength was gone. Worse, childbed fever set in, that killer of so many mothers, the infection that no maester could cure. For 3 days she burned with fever, drifting in and out of consciousness, weakening steadily despite every effort to save her. On the 3rd day, in a moment of clarity, Lyanna made a choice that was entirely her own. She rose from her bed, pushed away the hands trying to restrain her, walked, stumbling, toward where Vhagar rested near the city. She wanted to die in the sky, on her dragon, the way a dragon rider should die, not sweating and suffering in a bed, not in the same mundane way any peasant woman might die. She never made it. She collapsed on the steps, too weak to go further. Daemon found her there and carried her back to her bed. Rhaenyra, who had become close friends with Lyanna over the years, sat vigil beside her, and there, surrounded by those who loved her, Lyanna Velaryon died. She was 28 years old. The news reached Driftmark like a thunderclap. Corlys stood in the great hall of high tide when the Raven arrived, holding the message that said his daughter was dead. His fierce, beautiful daughter, who had claimed the greatest dragon in the world, gone. killed not in battle, not by enemy action, but by the same mundane tragedy that claimed thousands of mothers every year. Rhaenys wept. For once her iron composure cracked completely, and she mourned with a mother's raw grief. Both her children now, Laenor dead. Laenor, their son, would die that same year, under circumstances that would raise more questions than answers. The funeral was held at Driftmark. Laena's body returned to her homeland for the traditional Velaryon sea burial. The entire extended family gathered, Targaryens, Velaryons, Hightowers, all come to pay their respects. Basila Rhaenyra, just 4 years old, stood confused and sad, too young to fully understand that their mother was gone forever. Corlys stood on the shore and watched as his daughter was committed to the waves. The sea that had given House Velaryon everything. The sea that had made him the richest man in Westeros. The sea that had carried him to the edge of the world and back. That same sea now took his daughter, pulled her down into darkness, claimed her as it had claimed so many Velaryons before. He had sailed through storms that shattered ships. He had fought pirates and survived battles. He had negotiated with merchant princes and emperors, but nothing in all those years had prepared him for the simple, savage pain of losing a child. Lyanna had wanted to die a dragon rider's death, in fire and glory. Instead, she died the way so many women died, her body betraying her in its most fundamental purpose. There was no glory in it, no songs, just loss. That night, alone in his chambers, Corlys Velaryon understood something he had been avoiding for years. All his wealth, all his achievement, all his careful planning and strategic thinking, none of it could protect the people he loved. The sea gave, and the sea took, and it took without mercy, without reason, without caring about your plans or your ambitions. He still had Laenor, still had his son, his heir, still had the marriage alliance with Rhaenyra that promised Valyrian blood on the throne eventually. There was still hope that everything he had worked for might come to fruition. But Lyanna was gone, and no amount of gold could bring her back. While Lyanna had been living her free life in Essos, Lyanna's path had taken a very different turn. In 113 AC, King Viserys named his daughter Rhaenyra as his heir, setting aside the claims of his sons by Alicent Hightower in favor of his eldest child. It was a decision that would eventually tear the realm apart, but at the time, it seemed like settled law. Rhaenyra would be queen. She needed a husband. The politics of the choice were delicate. Marry her to one of the great lords, and you risked elevating that house too much, creating jealousy and resentment. Marry her to a foreign prince, and you risked foreign influence over the Iron Throne. The husband needed to be noble enough to be acceptable, connected enough to bring advantage, but not so powerful as to overshadow the princess herself. Corlys had been planning for this moment since the day Lyanna was rejected. If he could not make his daughter queen, perhaps he could make his son the prince consort. The calculations were different, but the result would be the same: his blood on the throne, his grandchildren ruling the 7 kingdoms. Laenor was 20 years old in 114 AC, handsome in the Valyrian way, a dragon rider bonded to sea smoke, well-educated and courteous. On the surface he was an ideal match. The richest house in the realm, ancient Valyrian blood dragons, everything a future queen could want in a consort. There was one complication that everyone knew about but no one discussed openly. Laenor's romantic interests lay firmly with men, not women. His closest companion was Sir Joffrey Lonmouth, a knight of good family, and their relationship was considerably more than friendship. In private, this was not particularly scandalous. Many noble families quietly accepted such arrangements as long as heirs were produced and appearances maintained. Rhaenyra herself understood. She and Lyanna discussed it candidly before the marriage. They would do their duty to the realm, produce children to secure the succession, but they would also each be free to pursue their own happiness in private. It seemed like a workable arrangement, a practical marriage for practical purposes. Both of them knew what was expected. Both agreed to the terms. The wedding in 114 AC should have been a grand celebration. Instead, it turned into a bloodbath. The ceremony itself went smoothly enough. Vows exchanged, a grand feast laid out. Nobles from across the realm gathered to witness the union of the heir to the throne with the son of the richest house in Westeros. Music played, wine flowed, everything seemed perfect. Then Ser Criston Cole, who had been Rhaenyra's sworn shield, and rumor suggested something more than that before his proposal to her was rejected, picked a fight with Ser Joffrey Lonmouth. The details varied, depending on who told the story. Some said Joffrey taunted him. Others claimed Criston simply snapped, unable to bear watching Rhaenyra marry another. Whatever the cause, Criston beat Joffrey to death in front of the entire court. Not a quick death in combat, but a brutal, extended beating that left Joffrey's face unrecognizable. Lyonor screamed and tried to reach his fallen lover, but was held back. The feast dissolved into chaos. Blood spread across the floor, mixing with spilled wine. Landor's marriage began with the murder of the man he loved. The shadow of that violence hung over everything that came after. Rhaenyra and Lyonor tried to make the arrangement work. They performed their duties, appeared together publicly, maintained the appearance of a functional royal marriage. And in late 114 AC, Rhaenyra gave birth to a son. They named him Jaehaerys, a fine Valyrian name, traditional for House Velaryon. But the child had brown hair and brown eyes, and features that did not look particularly Valyrian at all. The Velaryons and Targaryens were known for their distinctive appearance. Silver gold hair, purple or pale blue eyes, fine features. These traits bred true, generation after generation. A child of Rhaenyra and Lyonor should have looked like them, should have had the unmistakable stamp of old Valyria. Jaehaerys did not. People began to whisper, at first quietly, then more openly. Rhaenyra's sworn shield during this time was Sir Harwin Strong, son of the Hand of the King, a man known for his great strength and kind nature, a man with brown hair and brown eyes, a man who seemed remarkably close to the princess. In 115 AC, Rhaenyra gave birth to a second son, Lucerys. He had the same brown hair, the same features that did not match his supposed parents. In 117 AC, a third son, Joffrey, named for the knight who had died at their wedding. Same brown hair, same un-Valyrian features. By this point, anyone with eyes could see the truth. These children were not descendants, they were Harwin Strong's. Rhaenyra and her lover had been careless, or perhaps simply unable to hide what nature made obvious. The court split between those who acknowledged the obvious truth and those who pretended not to see it. To speak openly of the bastardy was treason, punishable by death. King Viserys refused to hear any such talk, insisted his grandsons were legitimate, threatened anyone who suggested otherwise, but the whispers continued. Corlys faced an impossible choice. He could see what everyone else saw. His son was not the father of these children. But if he acknowledged that truth, everything he had worked for would collapse. The children would be bastards, unable to inherit, the line would end. House Velaryon's claim to future power would evaporate. Or he could choose ambition over truth, publicly acknowledge these brown-haired boys as his legitimate grandsons, pretend not to see what was obvious to everyone, accept the lie and all the mockery and whispers that came with it. He chose ambition. His reasoning was coldly practical. History does not remember blood, it remembers names. If these boys were raised as Velaryons, if they carried his name and inherited his titles, if they eventually sat the Iron Throne as kings of the Seven Kingdoms, What did it matter whose seed had actually planted them? The world would remember them as Velaryons. That was what mattered. But the cost of that choice would be higher than he imagined. Ladenor retreated into wine and the company of his favorites. He had done his duty as his father demanded, lent his name to children who were not his, maintained the appearance of a marriage that was a sham, but the price was his spirit. He drank more. He grew distant from his family, spending more time away from Dragonstone, where Rhaenyra made her seat. When he was present, he seemed hollow, going through motions without real engagement. Corlys watched his son's decline with growing concern, but did nothing to stop it. Ladenor had a role to play. The realm needed to see a stable marriage, a functional royal family. Personal happiness was secondary to duty and legacy. Rhaenys was less willing to maintain the pretense. She loved her grandsons, genuinely loved them, despite knowing they were not Laena's blood. But she saw what the arrangement was doing to her son, saw the mockery House Velaryon endured at court, heard the whispers and the barely concealed contempt. She and Corlys argued about it behind closed doors. She wanted him to acknowledge reality, to find some other path forward that did not require sacrificing their son's dignity. He insisted they had come too far to turn back now, that admitting the truth would destroy everything. The boys themselves grew up in this strange twilight. Jace, Luke, and little Joffrey, raised as princes, as Velaryons, as dragon riders. They were kind boys, good boys, taught well by their mother and genuinely loved by their grandfather, despite everything. But they could feel the weight of the whispers, the way people looked at them, the questions that hung in the air whenever they entered a room. At court, Queen Alicent's sons by King Viserys, Aegon and Aemond, were raised alongside them. The differences were stark and deliberately emphasized. Aegon and Aemond had proper Valyrian features. They were true-born princes. No question about their legitimacy. The contrast was pointed, constant, impossible to ignore. Tensions built slowly. Childish taunts between boys became something darker. Aegon called them bastards. Aemond sneered at their brown hair. Fights broke out, quickly suppressed by adults, but never truly resolved. Corlys maintained his position. These were his grandsons. They would inherit Driftmark. They would support Rhaenyra's claim to the throne. They would carry House Velaryon into the future. Anyone who suggested otherwise was a traitor and a liar. His nephew Vaemond Velaryon was less willing to play along. Vaemond was the son of Corlys's younger brother, next in line by blood, if Laenor's line was set aside. He began quietly at first, to voice doubts about the succession, to suggest that perhaps Driftmark should pass to true Velaryon blood rather than bastards hiding behind a noble name. Corlys silenced him each time, angrily, forcefully, with threats when necessary. But he could not silence everyone. The doubts spread like cracks in stone, invisible at first, but growing wider with each passing year. Through it all, Laenor drifted, present but absent, alive but not really living. He flew sea smoke sometimes, finding brief freedom in the sky, but mostly he drank and disappeared into the company of young men who offered distraction, if not genuine connection. This was the price of Corlys's ambition. His daughter dead, his son hollowed out, his house openly mocked, his legacy built on a lie that everyone knew but no one could speak aloud. But he told himself it would be worth it. When Rhaenyra took the throne, when his grandsons ruled after her, when House Velaryon stood at the pinnacle of power in Westeros, then all of this, all the compromise and shame and loss, it would be justified. The sea had taught him patience, taught him that sometimes you had to weather storms to reach your destination. This was just another storm. He would endure it. He would survive it. And eventually, he was certain, the sea would give him what it had always given him: victory, success, everything he had dreamed of. He did not yet understand that the sea was done giving, that from this point forward it would only take and take and take, until there was almost nothing left. The year 120 AC would be remembered as the year of the Red Spring, when a series of tragedies struck House Velaryon and House Targaryen in quick succession. Laena's death in Pentos was only the beginning. Before the year ended, death would claim others, and the fragile peace holding the realm together would begin to crack apart. Not long after news of Laena's death reached Westeros, Laenor traveled to Spicetown, a harbor town on Driftmark, to attend a fair. He was accompanied by Sir Corlys, one of his favorites, a young knight he had grown close to in recent months. What exactly happened next became the subject of intense speculation and whispered rumors that would never quite die. The official story was straightforward. Lyndor and Corlys quarreled, possibly over another young man, possibly over something else entirely. The argument turned violent. Corlys drew his sword. Lyndor, drunk and caught off guard, was killed. A servant discovered the body and raised the alarm. By the time others arrived, Corlys had fled, and the body had been thrown into a fireplace, burned beyond recognition. Corlys received the news while still reeling from Laena's death. Both his children, dead within months of each other. The son who was supposed to carry on his line, gone. The succession he had carefully planned, thrown into chaos. He stood in the great hall of high tide, the message clutched in his hand, and for the first time in decades, the sea snake felt truly old. He had survived storms and battles, had sailed to the edge of the world and back, had built a fortune and a legacy that should have lasted generations, and now his children were dead, both of them. The hall that should have been filled with grandchildren running and playing with the sound of the next generation felt hollow and empty. Rhaenys collapsed when she heard. The queen who never was, always so strong and proud, broke completely. She had lost both her children. Laena in childbed in Pentos, Laena murdered in Spicetown. The pain of it was beyond bearing. She withdrew into her chambers and would not come out, would not eat, would not speak to anyone. The funeral arrangements were made quickly. The body that was supposedly Lyndor, burned beyond identification, would be given a traditional sea burial. The family would gather, they would mourn, they would try to move forward. But there were questions, quiet questions, that people asked in whispers when they thought no one was listening. The body had been burned too thoroughly, too conveniently. Corlys had disappeared completely, never found, despite searches, and just days after Laenor's death, something happened that made many people deeply suspicious. Rhaenyra Targaryen married Prince Daemon, not months later, not after a respectful period of mourning, days later, on Dragonstone. In a private ceremony, with only a handful of witnesses, the princess, supposedly grieving her dead husband, wed his uncle with unseemly haste. The scandal exploded across the realm. People could not believe the audacity of it. Laenor barely cold, Laenor barely buried, and Daemon and Rhaenyra were married. It looked terrible. It suggested things that people barely dared to speak aloud. Had Daemon and Rhaenyra arranged Lyndor's death? Had they conspired to remove the inconvenient husband so they could marry? Was Lyndor's death murder rather than a tragic quarrel? The truth, though few knew it, was stranger and perhaps more merciful than the rumors suggested. Lyonor was not dead. He and Carl had staged the whole thing with Rhaenyra and Daemon's help. Some nameless servant, similar enough in build, had been killed and burned beyond recognition. Lyonor had taken a ship to Essos, where he could finally live freely, openly with Carl, away from the suffocating expectations of Westerosi nobility. He would spend the rest of his life in Pentos or Lys or one of the other free cities, anonymous and happy in a way he never could have been as a Velaryon prince. But Corlys and Rhaenys did not know this. They believed their son was truly dead. They mourned genuinely, and when they learned of Rhaenyra and Daemon's marriage, they felt betrayed, used. The political alliance they had sacrificed so much for now seemed like a cruel joke. Their son's death, real or staged, had been convenient for Rhaenyra and Daemon. That was how it looked. Corlys swallowed his rage. He had no choice. Rhaenyra was still the heir. Her sons, his supposed grandsons, were still in line for the throne. Breaking the alliance now would mean admitting that everything he had endured, all the mockery and shame, had been for nothing. So he bent his pride once again, publicly supported the marriage, maintained the appearance of family unity. But the wound was deep, the trust was damaged, and worse was yet to come. In 126 AC, Lelena's funeral brought the entire extended family together at Driftmark. 6 years had passed since that terrible year. Time enough for wounds to begin healing, though never enough to make them disappear entirely. Daemon was there with Baela and Rhaenyra, now 10 years old, beautiful children who barely remembered their mother. Rhaenyra was there with her sons, Jace's now 12, Luke 11, and little Joffrey 9. Queen Alicent brought her children, Aegon, Haelysere, Aemond, and young Daeron. King Viserys, visibly declining in health, made the journey despite his frailty. The funeral itself was somber and proper. Laenor was committed to the waves in the traditional Velaryon manner. The family stood together on the shore, presenting a united front to the world, even as tensions simmered beneath the surface. That night, while the adults drank and talked in the halls of High Tide, the children slipped out into the darkness. And there, on the beach near where Vhagar rested, the long festering hatred between them finally erupted. Aemon Targaryen, second son of King Viserys and Queen Alicent, had lived his entire life in the shadow of his older brother Aegon. Unlike his siblings, he did not have a dragon. The eggs placed in his cradle had never hatched. He had tried to bond with other dragons without success. It was a source of deep shame for him, made worse by the constant taunting from other children. That night, he saw his chance. Vhagar, the largest dragon in the world, was riderless. Laenor was dead. The dragon had no bond to hold her. Beemond approached the massive creature in the darkness, showing courage far beyond his years, and Vhagar, ancient and grieving, accepted him. When Baela and Rhaenyra discovered that Aemond had claimed their dead mother's dragon, they were furious. How dare he? Before Laenor was even properly mourned, they attacked him, 2 small girls, against a boy several years older. Jace and Luke joined in, defending their cousins, 4 children against 1. The fight was brutal and chaotic. Aemond held his own, despite being outnumbered, fueled by rage and triumph at finally having a dragon. He called them bastards, threw the truth in their faces. Luke, small for his age, but fierce when provoked, drew a knife and slashed at Aemond's face. The blade took his eye, not cleanly but messily, leaving Aemond screaming in pain and blood pouring down his face. The adults came running at the sound. What they found was a scene of horror. Aemond clutching his ruined face, blood everywhere, the other children crying and frightened, and in the chaos that followed, the fragile peace between the 2 factions of the family shattered completely. King Viserys demanded to know what had happened, and Daemon, even in his pain, told the truth. They had attacked him. He had only defended himself. But before that, he said, he had called them bastards. The word hung in the air like poison. Everyone knew what it meant. Everyone understood the implications, but it had always been unspoken, a truth that could not be acknowledged. Viserys demanded to know where Aemond had heard such lies. The boy, brave or foolish or simply past caring, said that everyone knew, that his mother had told him, that Aegon had told him, that it was common knowledge throughout the realm. Queen Alicent demanded justice, an eye for an eye. If Lucerys had taken Anemon's eye, he should lose his own. It was fair, proportionate, the ancient law of retribution. Viserys refused. He insisted that the accusation of bastardy was a vile lie, that anyone who repeated it would lose their tongue. But everyone in that room knew he was lying, knew he was protecting Rhaenyra and her sons at the cost of his son's eye, and the truth itself. Alicent, pushed beyond endurance, snatched the Valyrian steel dagger from Viserys' belt and lunged at Rhaenyra. She wanted to take an eye herself, to force the justice her husband refused to give. Rhaenyra fought back. Blood was spilled, though not the eye Alicent wanted. The two families were irrevocably split after that night. Any pretense of unity, any hope of peaceful coexistence, was gone. Aemond would grow up with his ruined face as a constant reminder of his hate. Alicent's children would never forgive or forget. And everyone knew, though no one said it openly, that eventually this would end in war. Corlys and Rhaenys watched their family tear itself apart. Their grandchildren, true blood or not, were threatened. Their allies were compromised. The succession that should have been secure was now desperately fragile. Aemond's final words that night would echo through the years to come. When his father tried to console him about losing his eye, the boy said simply that it was a fair exchange. He had lost an eye, but gained a dragon, the largest, oldest, most powerful dragon in the world. It was the thinking of someone who understood that sometimes you had to sacrifice to gain power, someone who would be willing to pay any price for what he wanted. In that, at least, he was very much like Corlys Velaryon. Both of them willing to sacrifice almost anything for their ambitions. Both of them convinced the price would be worth it. Both of them wrong. The years following the Driftmark incident passed in uneasy tension. King Viserys grew steadily weaker, his body failing even as he desperately tried to hold his family together through sheer force of will. The realm watched and waited, everyone understanding that when the king finally died, the question of succession would tear Westeros apart. In 126 AC, fate dealt another blow to House Velaryon. Corlys was fighting in the Stepstones again, a second campaign to drive out a resurgent triarchy that had once more seized control of those strategic islands. At 73 years old, he should have been home at high tide, letting younger men fight his battles. But the sea snake had never been content to sit idle while others defended his interests. During a battle on one of the rocky islands, Corlys took a wound, not immediately fatal, but deep and dangerous. By the time his men got him back to Driftmark, infection had set in, fever gripped him. For weeks he lay in his chambers, drifting in and out of consciousness, while Maesters tried everything they knew to save him. The question of succession suddenly became urgent. If Corlys died, who would inherit Driftmark? Officially, it should pass to Jaehaerys as Landor's eldest son. But Jace was also heir to Dragonstone, and after his mother, the Iron Throne itself, he could not hold all 3 seats. So the inheritance should pass to the second son, Lucerys. Vaemond Velaryon saw his opportunity. For years he had kept his objections quiet, biding his time, waiting for the moment when he could finally speak the truth that everyone knew but no one would acknowledge. With Corlys apparently dying, that moment had arrived. He traveled to King's Landing and petitioned the king directly. He wanted Driftmark for himself. As the closest legitimate male relative of Corlys, he had the support of his sons and several other Velaryon relatives who shared his views, and he was willing to say what others would not. The boys were bastards. Everyone knew it. Strong bastards wearing the Velaryon name like a costume. They had no right to Driftmark, no right to the Driftwood throne, no right to the legacy that true Velaryons had built over centuries. The accusation was formally made before the Iron Throne. Vaemond was careful in his wording at first. suggesting rather than stating directly, using the kind of language that might avoid charges of treason while still making his meaning clear. He spoke of the importance of true blood, of legitimate succession, of not allowing ancient houses to fall into the hands of those with no real claim. King Viserys, now more corpse than man, his face half rotted away by disease, his body held together by milk of the poppy and stubbornness, refused to hear it. He had spent years denying this truth. He would not acknowledge it now. But Rhaenys traveled to King's Landing to defend her grandson's claim. She knew the truth as well as anyone. She had argued with Corlys about it behind closed doors. But she also loved those boys, had raised them as her own grandchildren, and she would not abandon them now. The court assembled to hear the case. Vaemond presented his arguments eloquently. The succession laws were clear. Driftmark should pass through legitimate bloodlines. He did not need to say the rest out loud. Everyone in that room could see what Jace and Luke looked like. Everyone could draw their own conclusions. Then Rhaenyra arrived from Dragonstone with Daemon at her side and her sons behind her. She had not been expected. The journey was difficult for her, as she was heavily pregnant with her 6th child. But she came anyway, understanding that this was about more than just Driftmark. This was about whether her sons would be acknowledged as legitimate, whether her claim to the throne would survive, whether everything she had built would crumble. King Viserys, who had not left his chambers in months, who could barely walk, somehow found the strength to attend. He dragged himself to the Iron Throne, refusing help, determined to settle this matter personally. The assembled court watched in horrified fascination as their dying king, this shambling remnant of what had once been a strong man, climbed those steps and seated himself. His judgment was swift and absolute. Luxeres was Lebanor's son. He would inherit Driftmark after his grandfather. Anyone who questioned this, anyone who spread lies about the legitimacy of his grandsons, would have their tongue removed. The matter was settled. Vaemond's control finally broke. He had spent years watching this farce, watching these obvious bastards parade around as Velaryons, watching his own rightful claim dismissed because the king refused to acknowledge reality. Standing before the Iron Throne in front of the entire court, he spoke the words that had been forbidden for so long. He called Rhaenyra a whore. He called her sons bastards. He said he would not see his house destroyed by pretenders, that he would not bend the knee to bastards wearing stolen names. The court gasped. Even by the standards of that brutal time, speaking such words before the king was suicidal. Viserys began to pronounce judgment, but he never finished. Daemon stepped forward and drew Dark Sister, his Valyrian steel sword. One swift stroke, and Vaemon's head was separated from his body. Not cleanly through the neck, but through the skull itself, the blade so sharp and Daemon's strike so precise that it cut through bone as easily as flesh. The body collapsed. Blood pooled on the floor before the Iron Throne. Daemon cleaned his blade calmly and sheathed it, looking at no one in particular. The message was clear. This was what happened to those who spoke the truth too loudly. Vaemon's sons, and those who had supported him, were stripped of their claims and lands. Some fled King's Landing immediately, fearing they would be next. Others bent the knee and swore loyalty to Lucerys' claim, choosing survival over principle. Word of what happened reached Driftmark, where Corlys was slowly recovering from his wound. The fever had broken. The infection had cleared. He would survive after all, though he would never fully regain his former strength. When they told him about Vanemon's death, about Daemon beheading his nephew before the Iron Throne, his reaction was complicated. Part of him was relieved. The challenge to his grandson's inheritance had been crushed. The succession was secure, at least for now. But another part of him understood what this meant. His own nephew, his brother's son, had been executed for speaking a truth that Corlys himself knew. The family was eating itself. Blood was being spilled to maintain a lie. Rhaenys came to his chambers. Once he was well enough to speak, she sat beside his bed, and they talked, really talked. For the first time in years, she told him that this had to end, that the price they were paying for ambition was too high, that watching another family member die to protect their grandson's false claims was more than she could bear. Corlys listened, but in the end, his answer was the same as it had always been. They had come too far to turn back. The boys were grown now, raised as Velaryons, recognized by the king himself. To abandon them now would be to admit that everything, all the sacrifice and compromise and loss, had been pointless. History does not remember blood, it remembers names. That was still his answer. That was all he had. In the months that followed, King Viserys made one final journey to King's Landing from Dragonstone. He hosted a dinner, gathering both sides of his fractured family, desperately trying to force them into something resembling unity. He gave speeches about family and love and legacy. He begged them to put aside their grievances for the sake of the realm. It was a beautiful sentiment. It was also completely futile. The hatreds ran too deep. The wounds were too fresh. Aemon sat at that table with his ruined face, a constant reminder of what had been taken from him. Alicent's children sat across from Rhaenyra's sons, and the contempt in their eyes was barely masked. Daemon watched everything with a sardonic smile, knowing exactly how this would end. That night, Viserys died in his sleep, peacefully, finally released from the burden of holding together a family that wanted nothing more than to tear itself apart. His death removed the last barrier between the two factions. The last voice calling for peace was silenced. What happened next would be debated and argued over for generations. The official version from the Greens, Alicent's faction, was that Viserys had changed his mind on his deathbed, that in his final moments, delirious with pain and milk of the poppy, he had named his son Aegon as his heir instead of Rhaenyra, that his last words were a command to place his son on the throne. The Blacks, Rhaenyra's supporters, called this a lie, a naked power grab by Otto Hightower and his daughter seizing the throne through deception while the rightful heir was away on Dragonstone. They claimed Viserys had never wavered in his support for Rhaenyra, that his last words had been misinterpreted or deliberately twisted. The truth probably lay somewhere in between, lost in the confusion of a dying man's final hours. The truth hardly mattered. What mattered was that Aegon was crowned in King's Landing before Rhaenyra even knew her father was dead. The fait accompli, the throne seized while she was absent. When the news reached Dragonstone, Rhaenyra went into early labor from the shock. She delivered a stillborn daughter, malformed and twisted. The grief of losing her father and her crown and her child all at once nearly destroyed her. But Daemon and her supporters rallied around her. They would not accept Aegon's coronation. Rhaenyra was the rightful heir. Viserys had named her. The lords of the realm had sworn oaths to her. Those oaths meant something. They had to mean something. The Black Council formed on Dragonstone. Rhaenyra's supporters gathered to plan their response, and Corlys Velaryon, 76 years old, still recovering from his near death in the Stepstones, took his place among them. He was named Hand of the Queen, the greatest honor he had ever received, the recognition he had sought for decades. His council finally given the weight it deserved. Everything he had dreamed of, achieved at last. But he looked around that council table and saw so few supporters, not enough to win, not nearly enough. The great houses that should have supported Rhaenyra's claim were hesitating, calculating, choosing neutrality, or secretly backing Aegon. Corlys knew war was coming. He had fought wars before. He understood the cost in blood and gold and lives. He knew this war would be worse than anything he had experienced. Civil war. dragon against dragon, family destroying family. And he understood something else, something that sat like a stone in his chest. This war was happening, at least in part, because of choices he had made, because he had insisted on maintaining the fiction of his grandson's legitimacy, because he had pushed forward with alliances and marriages that everyone knew were built on lies, because his ambition had been stronger than his wisdom. But there was no going back. The pieces were in motion. The war was inevitable. All he could do now was try to win it, try to place Rhaenyra on the throne, secure his grandson's inheritance, and hope that victory would justify everything he had sacrificed. The sea had given him wealth and fame, had carried him to the edge of the world and back, had made him a legend. Now it would demand payment for all those gifts, and the price would be measured in blood. His blood. His family's blood. The blood of everyone he loved. The dance of the dragons was about to begin, and Corlys Velaryon, the sea snake, hand of the queen, would watch helplessly as it consumed everything he had spent a lifetime building. War came to Westeros in the year 129 AC, and it came riding on dragon wings, the dance of the dragons, as the singers would later call it, though there was nothing beautiful or graceful about it. Just death and fire and the systematic destruction of everything the Targaryen dynasty had built. The early moves were political and strategic. Ravens flew to every corner of the realm, both sides seeking allies and calling in old oaths. The map of Westeros divided itself along complicated lines. The north declared for Rhaenyra, as did the Vale and most of the Riverlands. The Reach and the Westerlands backed Aegon. The Stormlands split, with some houses on each side. Dorne, as always, stayed out of it entirely. But the real power in this war was not measured in soldiers or castles, it was measured in dragons. The Blacks had more dragons, including some of the largest and most fearsome. The Greens had fewer, but were more consolidated in King's Landing, with access to the royal treasury. Corlys' contribution to the war effort was the one thing he could provide better than anyone else. Ships. The Velaryon fleet, the largest private navy in the known world, became Rhaenyra's navy. Corlys commanded it personally, despite his age, despite the lingering weakness from his wound in the Stepstones. His strategy was sound. Control the sea, and you control trade. Control trade, and you control the flow of gold and supplies. He instituted a blockade of King's Landing, using his ships to close off Blackwater Bay. Nothing in, nothing out. The city that held 500,000 people would be starved into submission. Additionally, his fleet controlled the Gullet, that stretch of water between Dragonstone and the mainland. Any attempt by the Greens to break the blockade would have to come through there. Corlys fortified those waters with everything he had. War galleys, patrol boats, merchant vessels converted into makeshift warships. The entire might of House Velaryon turned toward a single purpose. The blockade worked, perhaps too well. Within weeks, food prices in King's Landing began to soar. The small folk, those common people who had no stake in which Targaryen sat the throne, started to go hungry. Anger built in the city, though it was not yet directed at anyone in particular. The Greens understood they needed to break the blockade or lose the war through starvation. They coordinated with the Triarchy, those same free cities that Corlys had fought twice before in the Stepstones. Gold changed hands, promises were made, and a fleet was assembled, the largest the Triarchy had ever sent against Westeros. The Battle of the Gullet began on a grey morning, when the Triarchy fleet appeared on the horizon. More than 100 ships, war galleys from Myr and Lys and Tyrosh, filled with soldiers and equipped with the latest weapons. Against them, Corlys commanded perhaps 70 ships, a formidable force but outnumbered. But the Blacks had dragons. Jacaerys flew Vermax, the young dragon he had bonded with as a boy. Corlys' strategy relied on the dragons providing air support while his ships engaged in close-quarters combat, where his crew's superior training and experience would matter most. The battle was chaos. Ships ramming each other, grappling hooks pulling vessels together, men fighting hand-to-hand across blood-slicked decks. Fire from the dragons rained down on the Triarchy fleet. Entire galleys burst into flame, their crews jumping into the water only to drown or be pulled under by the weight of their armor. Corlys commanded from his flagship, directing the battle with the same skill that had made him a legend. His ships moved in coordinated patterns, attacking weak points in the enemy formation, avoiding the strongest concentrations of force. Despite being outnumbered, his fleet was winning. Then, disaster struck. The Triarchy had prepared for dragons this time. They had scorpions, those massive crossbows designed specifically to bring down flying creatures. They had trained their crews, practiced the timing needed to hit a fast-moving target in the air, and they had been patient, waiting for their moment. Jacaerys flew low over the enemy fleet, Vermax breathing fire onto a cluster of ships. From 3 different vessels, scorpion bolts flew. One missed. One struck Vermax's wing, tearing through the membrane but not disabling him. The third hit Jace's directly, punching through his body with the force of a ballista. The boy tumbled from his saddle. Vermax, wounded and grieving, plummeted after him. They hit the water together, dragon and rider, and disappeared beneath the waves. Neither surfaced. Corlys saw it happen. From his deck, he watched his grandson, 15 years old, his supposed heir, fall from the sky and vanish. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The sounds of battle faded. All he could see was that spot where Jace had disappeared, as if by staring hard enough he could make the boy reappear. But the sea kept its dead. The sea always kept its dead. The battle continued without him for crucial minutes, while Corlys stood frozen. His officers took command, kept the fleet fighting, eventually drove off what remained of the Triarchy forces. It was a victory by any military measure. The blockade held, the enemy retreated. King's Landing remained cut off. But Corlys had lost his grandson, his eldest grandson, the one he had invested so much in, the one who was supposed to inherit everything, gone. Drowned in the cold waters of the gullet, his body never recovered, another offering to the sea that had defined House Velaryon for generations. That night, after the surviving ships had been counted and the wounded tended to, Corlys stood on the deck of his flagship and stared out at dark water. He was 76 years old. He had lost both his children. Now he had lost his eldest grandson. The succession he had fought so hard to secure was unraveling. Every victory cost more than it gained. Rhaenyra received the news on Dragonstone and went nearly mad with grief. Jace had been her firstborn, her favorite, the son she had doted on, despite or perhaps because of the questions about his paternity. She locked herself in her chambers and would not come out for days. When she finally emerged, something had changed in her. The grief had curdled into paranoia and rage. She began to see traitors everywhere. Men who had supported her loyally for years suddenly came under suspicion. She ordered arrests, interrogations, executions. Her judgment, never perfect, became increasingly erratic. Corlys watched with growing alarm as the queen he served descended into a darkness that would eventually destroy her. The war ground on through 129 AC and into 130 AC. Battles were fought across Westeros. Dragons died. Cities burned. The realm that Viserys had tried so desperately to hold together was being systematically torn apart. King's Landing eventually fell to Rhaenyra's forces, though not through the blockade. Daemon and his allies seized the city in a lightning strike while Aegon fled. Rhaenyra entered the capital in triumph, finally sitting the Iron Throne that had been denied to her mother a generation earlier. But her reign was a disaster from the start. The city hated her. The small folk, starved by the blockade, blamed her for their suffering. Her increasingly paranoid behavior alienated potential allies. She ordered brutal executions, punishing not just enemies but anyone she suspected of disloyalty. Corlys served as her hand, trying to moderate her worst impulses, counseling mercy and pragmatism. She ignored him more often than not, the same pattern he had seen his entire life. His advice sought when convenient, dismissed when it contradicted what those in power wanted to hear. Then came the confrontation that nearly destroyed him. Rhaenyra, convinced there were traitors in her midst, accused Corlys himself of disloyalty. The evidence was thin and circumstantial, but in her paranoid state she saw plots everywhere. She had him arrested and thrown in the dungeons of the Red Keep. The man who had given everything for her cause, who had provided the ships and gold that made her campaign possible, who had lost his grandson fighting her battles, was now imprisoned and facing possible execution. Rhaenys interceded, along with others on the council. They convinced Rhaenyra that killing her hand would be politically disastrous. She released him, but the trust was shattered. Corlys returned to his duties, but he understood now what he had been too proud or too stubborn to see before. Rhaenyra was not fit to rule. The queen he had supported, the cause he had given everything for, was collapsing under the weight of her own instability. Word reached King's Landing that Daemon and Aemond had fought their final battle above the God's Eye, that great lake in the Riverlands. Both riders died, both dragons destroyed, locked together in mutual annihilation as they plummeted into the water. Daemon, who had been Rhaenyra's greatest supporter and most fearsome weapon, was gone. And Lucerys, Corlys' second grandson, the one who was supposed to inherit Driftmark, had died early in the war. Sent as a messenger to Storm's End, he had encountered Aemond there. Aemond, who had never forgiven losing his eye. A chase through storm clouds. Vhagar so much larger than Luke's little dragon Arax, hunting them through the darkness. Luke had died terrified, his dragon torn apart, his body never found. 2 grandsons dead, both drowned or fallen into water, as if the sea demanded payment in Velaryon blood. The small folk of King's Landing finally rose in revolt. Thousands stormed through the streets, attacking anyone associated with Rhaenyra's regime. They broke into the dragon pit and slaughtered the dragons housed there, killing those magnificent creatures with spears and axes and sheer overwhelming numbers. The city descended into madness. Rhaenyra fled back to Dragonstone, abandoning King's Landing to chaos. Corlys, seeing which way the wind was blowing, took his fleet back to Driftmark. He had supported Rhaenyra because he believed in her claim, because his family's future was tied to hers, because he had invested too much to back out. But she was finished. Even if she somehow regained King's Landing, her reign would never be stable. The realm would never accept her. The cause was lost. The news came shortly after. Rhaenyra was dead, fed to Aegon's dragon Sunfire on Dragonstone, killed by her own brother in the most brutal way imaginable. The queen who never truly reigned, dead at 33, her cause in ruins, her supporters scattered. Corlys sat in the great hall of high tide and tried to comprehend what he had lost. His daughter, his son, both his grandsons who might have inherited Driftmark. His fleet was battered, his treasury depleted, his reputation damaged by association with a failed cause. The war had consumed everything, exactly as he had feared. The hall was quiet now. No children running through it, no sound of the next generation growing and playing. Just an old man sitting alone, surrounded by treasures from 9 legendary voyages that suddenly seemed meaningless. The sea had taken his payment, his children, his grandchildren, his wealth, his reputation. Everything he had built through a lifetime of achievement and ambition, gone, consumed by fire and blood and the endless hunger of civil war. And the worst part, The truth he could barely admit to himself was that he had helped cause this. His choices, his insistence on pushing forward with alliances everyone knew were flawed, his refusal to acknowledge reality when it was inconvenient. He had helped light the fire that burned Westeros to ash. Outside, the waves crashed against the shore of Driftmark, eternal and uncaring. The sea that had made House Velaryon, the sea that had now broken it. The war ended not with triumph, but with exhaustion. Aegon II was victorious, back on the throne in King's Landing, but the victory was hollow. He was crippled and half-mad from his wounds, barely able to walk, ruling more through spite than any real vision for the realm. Rhaenyra was dead, her cause crushed, her supporters scattered or executed. Corlys faced an impossible situation. He had supported the losing side. His grandsons, the ones who might have inherited his seat and vindicated his choices, were dead. His fleet was diminished. His house was vulnerable, and Aegon II had every reason to destroy him completely as punishment for backing Rhaenyra. But Corlys Velaryon had not survived 76 years, 9 legendary voyages, 2 Stepstones wars, and a civil war by being inflexible. He understood when to fight and when to bend. He understood that sometimes survival required swallowing your pride and making deals with people you despised. He bent the knee to Aegon II, publicly acknowledged him as the rightful king, offered his remaining fleet and his loyalty in exchange for mercy. It was a humiliating surrender from a man who had once been the most powerful lord in Westeros outside the royal family. Aegon wanted to execute him, wanted to seize Driftmark and give it to someone who had supported the Greens from the beginning. The small council debated what to do with the sea snake. Some argued for mercy, pointing out that killing such a legendary figure would create martyrs and resentment. Others demanded harsh punishment as an example. Before a final decision was made, fate intervened once more. Aegon was poisoned, killed by his own counselors who had grown tired of his erratic and vengeful rule. The men around him understood that the realm needed stability more than it needed revenge. They needed to end the war in a way that would prevent it from simply reigniting in a few years. The solution was a compromise that no one particularly liked, but everyone could live with. Aegon III, son of Rhaenyra and Daemon, would take the throne. He was only 11 years old, untainted by the worst of the war's atrocities, and had a claim through both sides of the conflict. His reign would represent reconciliation rather than the victory of one faction over another. A council of regents would rule until he came of age, and Corlys Velaryon, despite everything, was named to that council. His experience, his knowledge, his sheer competence were too valuable to waste. The realm needed men who understood governance, not just warriors and schemers. So Corlys found himself back in King's Landing, back on the small council, advising another young king. Everything he had wanted, achieved in the worst possible way. His blood was connected to the throne, but only because Daemon's children by Laedina would marry into the royal line. His house would survive, but diminished and damaged. The irony was bitter. A Targaryen with Velaryon blood sat the Iron Throne, exactly what he had wanted. But the path to that outcome had cost him everything he loved. He returned to Driftmark between council sessions, and the emptiness of high tide haunted him. Rhaenys was still alive, but she had become a ghost of herself. The queen who never was had lost both her children and watched her grandsons die. The weight of that grief had broken something fundamental in her. She moved through the castle quietly, speaking little, her fierce spirit dimmed. They sat together some evenings, these two survivors, and talked about nothing in particular. The weather, the state of the ships, small matters that did not touch on the great wounds they carried. It was all they could manage. The deeper conversations, the recriminations and regrets, were too painful to voice. In 133 AC, Rhaenys died peacefully in her sleep. No violence, no drama, just an old woman's heart finally giving out after too much grief. Corlys buried her with all the ceremony befitting a princess of the blood, committing her to the sea in the Velaryon tradition. And then he was truly alone. His brother Vaemond was dead, executed years ago for speaking the truth. His nephew and those who had supported Vaemond's claim were gone, killed or exiled. His children, dead. His grandchildren, who might have inherited, dead. The line that should have continued House Velaryon had been cut short. He needed an heir, someone to pass the seat and the name to, someone to ensure that House Velaryon survived beyond his death. In desperation, he turned to the only option left. Alan of Hull was a young man, a bastard born to a shipwright's daughter on Driftmark. The rumors said he was Lenonor's son, conceived during one of his brief attempts to father children in the traditional way. But other whispers suggested he might be Corlys' own bastard, the product of some long-ago indiscretion. The truth hardly mattered. Alan was smart, capable, a skilled sailor who had proven himself repeatedly. He had Valyrian features, silver hair that suggested noble blood, and most importantly, he was loyal and available. Corlys legitimized him, gave him the Velaryon name, named him heir to Driftmark, the great house that could trace its lineage back to old Valyria, that had been ruled by legendary seafarers and dragon riders, would now pass to a bastard from Driftmark's harbor district. The mighty brought low. The ancient line continued through the most humble means. Alan took to his new status with grace. Corlys taught him everything he could, the routes he had sailed, the contacts in distant ports, the management of fleets, and the politics of the realm. The young man proved an able student, perhaps more able than Lenonor had ever been. But teaching Alan meant confronting all the choices that had led here. Corlys found himself explaining why he had done things certain ways, and in the explaining, seeing clearly for the first time how many mistakes he had made, how his ambition had blinded him, how his refusal to acknowledge uncomfortable truths had contributed to disaster. He walked the beaches of Driftmark in his final years, an old man alone with his thoughts. The sea still called to him, but he had no desire to answer. He had sailed to the edge of the world and back. He had built a fortune that rivaled kings. He had fought wars and made alliances and played the great game of thrones. And what did he have to show for it? An empty castle, dead children, a legacy preserved only through the legitimization of a bastard, memories of treasure and wonder mixed with memories of loss and grief. The younger Corlys, the bold captain who had first sailed to Qarth, would not have recognized what he had become. That young man had believed the world could be conquered through skill and daring, that wealth and achievement would bring everything else worth having, that the sea would always give more than it took. The old Corlys knew better, knew that the sea demanded payment, that ambition came with costs that could not always be foreseen, that sometimes the things you sacrificed to achieve your goals turned out to be the only things that actually mattered. He thought often of Laena in those final years, his fierce daughter who had wanted to die in the sky, who had found happiness on her own terms, away from the politics and scheming. She had been wiser than he had understood at the time. She had known that some things, freedom and love and simple joy, were worth more than crowns and thrones. And Lenonor, his gentle son, who had never wanted the life mapped out for him, who had been forced to play a role he hated for the sake of family ambition. If Corlys had let him go earlier, let him find his own way, would he be alive now? Would he have found happiness in Essos with Cole, living a quiet life away from dragons and succession crises? The questions haunted him, the what-ifs and might-have-beens, the realization that his children might have been happier, might have lived longer if he had been less ambitious for them. Baela and Rhaena, Daemon's daughters by Lyanna had survived the war and married well. They gave him great-grandchildren, beautiful babies with silver hair. He held them sometimes and felt a complicated mix of joy and sorrow. The line continued. The blood persisted. But these children would never know their grandmother Lyanna, or their uncles Jace and Luke, or the family that might have been. On the 6th day of the 3rd moon of 132 AC, Corlys Velaryon died in his bed at high tide. He was 79 years old. He died peacefully, without pain, simply going to sleep and not waking up. The sea finally called him home. They burned his body on a ship. In the old Velaryon tradition, Alyn, his legitimized heir, gave the command to light the pyre. The ship drifted out to sea, flames rising as it went, until it disappeared over the horizon. The sea snake returned to the waters that had defined his life, his ashes joining the countless Velaryons who had gone before. The Maesters would write that he had lived an extraordinary life, that he had served 4 kings and a queen, sailed to the ends of the earth, raised House Velaryon to unprecedented levels of wealth and power. They would call him a legend, one of the greatest sailors and merchants who ever lived. But sitting alone in those final years, Corlys had wondered if any of it had been worth the price. His children were dead. His grandchildren, who should have carried on his name, were dead. His house survived, but diminished. And the Iron Throne that he had sacrificed so much to influence would be contested and fought over again in future generations. The sea had given him wealth beyond measure, had carried him to wonders beyond imagination, had made him famous and respected. And in the end, the sea had taken it all back, taken his family, taken his pride, taken everything except the name and the stories. Perhaps that was all anyone could hope for, to be remembered, to have stories told about you, to leave some mark on the world that would outlast your bones. But in the darkness of night, alone in his chambers, Corlys had thought that maybe he would trade it all the voyages and wealth and fame, all the legendary accomplishments and political victories, trade it all for one more day, with Lyanna laughing as she flew Vega, one more evening with Lyanna reading poetry by the fire, one more night with Rhaenys when they were young, and the future seemed full of promise. The sea gives, and the sea takes, and in the end, we are all just sailors on borrowed time, hoping to make it home before the storm catches us. Corlys Velaryon made it home, but the cost of the journey had been everything he loved. The waves roll against the shores of Driftmark tonight, as they have for thousands of years, as they will for thousands more. The island sits quiet under starlight, the castle of high tide casting long shadows across the water. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the echo of voices that once filled those halls. Children laughing, dragons calling, ships creaking in the harbor as they prepared for voyages to distant lands. But those sounds are only memories now, carried on the wind like whispers from another age. House Velaryon survived the Dance of Dragons, though the survival came at a cost that can barely be calculated. Athlin of Hull, legitimized and made Lord of the Tides, proved himself worthy of the name he had been given. He rebuilt the fleet, restored the trade routes, brought some measure of prosperity back to Driftmark. The Velaryon ships once again sailed to Essos and beyond, carrying goods and maintaining the legacy of maritime power that the sea snake had built. But something was lost that could never be recovered. That sense of destiny, of being at the center of great events, of having influence that rivaled the throne itself. The war had shown the limits of wealth and ambition, had demonstrated that no amount of gold could protect you from the flames of civil war, from the cost of choosing sides in conflicts between dragons. The younger generations of Velaryons learned to be more cautious. They maintained their fleet and their wealth, but they stayed out of politics as much as possible. Let the Targaryens fight among themselves. Let other houses jockey for position at court. The Velaryons would sail and trade and survive, but they would not again reach for power that came at such a terrible price. The treasures that Corlys brought back from his 9 voyages remained at high tide for generations. Silk from Yi, faded now but still beautiful. Jade from Karth, cool and smooth to the touch. Maps of distant lands, the ink aging but the roots still traceable. These artifacts became museum pieces, reminders of when House Velaryon had been led by someone bold enough to sail beyond every horizon. Young Velaryons would walk through those halls and hear the stories about the sea snake who circumnavigated the world, about Lelina who rode Viga, about the family that stood at the center of the Dance of Dragons and paid for that position with blood. The stories were told with pride, but also with caution. Look what we achieved, the elders would say, but look what it cost. Driftmark itself slowly changed character. The ambition that had driven Corlys, that hunger to be more than just another noble house, gradually faded. The castle remained impressive, the fleet remained strong, but the fire that had pushed them toward the throne diminished to embers. Perhaps that was wisdom. Perhaps it was just exhaustion. Either way, House Velaryon became something different after the dance. Still noble, still wealthy, still respected, but no longer reaching for the stars. The sea continued its eternal rhythm, caring nothing for the ambitions of men or the fall of houses. Ships still sailed from Driftmark's harbor, though they carried merchants now more often than warriors. The routes that Corlys had pioneered remained valuable, bringing eastern goods to western markets, maintaining the flow of trade that was the lifeblood of commerce. Sometimes, on quiet nights, sailors would swear they saw a ghost ship on the horizon, an ancient vessel with the seahorse of House Velaryon on its sails, gliding across the water without wind or oars. They said it was the sea snake himself, still sailing, still seeking that next horizon, still searching for something that wealth and achievement could never quite provide. The story of Corlys Velaryon became a favorite among sailors and merchants across the known world. In the taverns of King's Landing and the trade houses of Bravos, in the markets of Volantis and the docks of Pentos, men would drink and tell tales of the man who had sailed further than anyone, who had seen wonders beyond imagination, who had built a fortune from nothing but skill and daring. But those who knew the full story, who understood not just the triumphs but the losses, would sometimes add a darker coda to those tales. Yes, he achieved great things. Yes, he became legendary. But remember what it cost him. Remember that wealth cannot buy back the dead. That ambition unchecked consumes everything it touches. There is a kind of poetry in it, if you look at the arc of his life with clear eyes. A boy who loved the sea became a man who conquered it. A merchant who sought respect became a lord who commanded fleets. A father who wanted his children to inherit crowns watched them die before their time. The very things he sacrificed for, the goals that drove him forward, remained forever just out of reach. And when he finally achieved proximity to the power he sought, it came in a form he could barely recognize, built on the ashes of everything he had lost. The sea gives. This is the lesson that every Velaryon learns from childhood. The sea provides fish and trade routes, adventure and wealth. It carries you to distant lands and brings you safely home if you respect its power. The sea is generous to those who understand it. But the sea also takes. This is the harder lesson, the one written in the empty places at family tables. The sea takes ships that venture too far, takes sailors who grow too confident, takes the unwary and the unlucky with equal indifference. And sometimes, when you have taken too much from the sea without proper payment, it demands compensation measured in the things you love most. Corlys gave the sea his children, his grandchildren, his wife, his pride, his certainty that skill and wealth could overcome any obstacle. In the end, he gave the sea his dreams and his ambitions, watching them dissolve like salt in water. What remained was legacy. A name that would be remembered, stories that would be told, a house that would continue, if not with the glory he had envisioned, then at least with the dignity of survival. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is all any of us can hope for, in the end, to be remembered kindly, to have our achievements outlast our failures, to leave the world slightly different than we found it, even if that difference is not always what we intended. The moon rises over Driftmark, casting silver light across the water. The castle sleeps. The harbor rests quiet until morning, when the ships will sail again as they always have. The rhythm continues, unbroken by the passing of individuals, no matter how legendary they might have been. Somewhere in the depths, in the cold darkness where drowned things rest, the treasures and secrets of generations lie scattered, wrecked ships and lost cargoes, the bones of sailors who pushed too far, the dreams of houses that reached too high. The sea keeps them all, a museum of ambition and failure, triumph and loss. And above, the living continue their dance, sailing and trading, building and dreaming, each generation learning the same lessons or failing to learn them. The cycle of ambition and loss, achievement and grief, plays out again and again under different names. The story of the sea snake ends here, on this quiet beach, with waves rolling in and out like breath. His body is ash now, scattered across the waters he loved. His voice is silent. His ambitions are settled into history, neither fully achieved nor completely failed, but something more complicated, something human. He wanted his blood on the throne. He got it, though not in the way he imagined, not with the glory he envisioned. He wanted House Velaryon to rival the Targaryens. It did for a time, though the rivalry cost more than either house could afford. He wanted to be remembered as great. He is, though the stories include his failures alongside his triumphs. Perhaps in those final years, he came to understand that the measure of a life is not in crowns or gold or political victories, not in how far you sailed or how much you accumulated, but in simpler things, the love of family, the loyalty of friends, the moments of joy snatched from between the struggles, the peace of sitting with your wife as the sun sets, talking about nothing important, just being together. He had those moments once, before ambition drove him to sacrifice them for larger goals. Before the Game of Thrones consumed everything in its path, they were there scattered through his life like pearls on a string, and he let them slip through his fingers in pursuit of something grander. The great tragedy of Corlys Velaryon is not that he failed. He did not fail, not entirely. He achieved much of what he set out to achieve. The tragedy is that by the time he succeeded, he understood that he had been chasing the wrong things all along. But that understanding came too late, as it so often does. And so the sea snake died, having conquered the world but lost his family, having achieved legend but sacrificed love, having reached the pinnacle of power only to find it empty. The stars wheel overhead, ancient and uncaring, the same stars that guided him to Karth and Yi-Ti, to the Shadowlands and back, the same stars that will guide future sailors on their own journeys of discovery and loss. The sky remembers nothing. The sea remembers nothing. Only the stories remain, passed from generation to generation, changed slightly with each telling until the truth and the legend become impossible to separate. And perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps we are all stories in the end. The facts of our lives, the dates and deeds, matter less than the tale that survives us. The sea snake story survives, flawed and complicated, glorious and tragic, a warning and an inspiration depending on how you choose to read it. So let us leave him here, the old sailor finally at rest. His ships bob gently in the harbor of memory. His children sleep beneath the waves. His dreams have dissolved into the morning mist, but his name endures. His story persists. And somewhere on a distant shore that no map has ever shown, perhaps he has finally found the peace that eluded him in life. The sea gives, The sea takes, and in the end we return to it, as all sailors must, completing the journey from birth to death, like ships sailing from harbor to harbor across an endless ocean. Rest well, Corlys Velaryon. Rest well, sea snake. Your voyage is complete. Your story is told, and the waves that carried you through life now carry you home at last, into the eternal embrace of the sea that made you and claimed you and will remember you in its own way, long after human memory has faded. The night deepens, the stars shine on, the water whispers against the shore, and if you listen closely, very closely, you might hear in that whisper the echo of all the stories the sea has collected over countless years. Stories of triumph and failure, love and loss, ambition and regret. Your story and mine. His story and hers. All of us sailors on the same vast ocean, heading toward the same distant shore. Sleep now. Let the rhythm of the waves carry you gently into dreams. Let the story of the sea snake remind you that we are all both more and less than we imagine ourselves to be. And let the eternal sea, which has witnessed everything and judges nothing, rock you softly into the peace of sleep. The journey is complete, the tale is told, and morning will come, as it always does, bringing new ships and new sailors and new stories yet to unfold. But for now, there is only the gentle darkness, the soft sound of water, the cooling night air, and the blessed release of sleep, that small death we practice every night, preparing for the final voyage that awaits us all. Rest easy. The sea has you now, and the sea, for all its taking, knows how to hold its children safe in the dark.